At 6:14 a.m., beneath frost-laced branches near an abandoned rail spur, a maintenance worker noticed a shape the snow refused to smooth. Police lights arrived quietly. Tape cut the cold. A young woman lay where winter had tried to erase her, and the silence felt measured, intentional, unfinished. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. The investigation that followed would become one of those cases men remember by season rather than by date, tied to the smell of pine and exhaust, to courthouse radiators clanking against December mornings, to folded newspapers laid beside coffee cups. In rural central Pennsylvania in 1997, winter arrived early and stayed late, sealing the ground and slowing answers. The victim was 22. Her name would appear once on a missing flyer, then again on a death notice, and then vanish into a file marked inactive for years. She was found outside the borough limits, where County Road met disused industry. The rail spur had not carried freight since the 70s, but locals still used it as a shortcut. The location mattered because it did not belong to anyone. Jurisdiction lines converged there, thin and confusing. State police were called first, then county detectives, then a coroner who drove in from a neighboring township with chains on his tires. The body was intact, clothing appropriate for late December, coat zipped, gloves present. There were no signs of a struggle visible at the scene. No blood in the snow, no weapon. The posture suggested placement rather than collapse. The first 48 hours were procedural and restrained. Photographs were taken from fixed distances. The ground was measured, then measured again. Tire impressions were shallow and indistinct, likely older than the snowfall. A single footprint near the brush line was logged but not attributed. The temperature had dipped below freezing overnight, preserving more than it destroyed, yet delaying the work that mattered most. The coroner noted hypothermia as a possible factor pending autopsy, but nothing could be concluded roadside. Her identification came from a wallet in her coat pocket. She lived in a small apartment off Market Street in a town that emptied after dusk. She worked part-time at a print shop and took night classes at a community college. Thanksgiving had been quiet that year, according to family, because money was tight. She planned to spend Christmas Eve with her parents and drive back before New Year's for work. She never arrived. Missing person flyers had gone up a week earlier, printed in black and white on the same presses she once operated. The photo showed her smiling, hair pulled back, eyes alert. The caption listed her age, height, last known clothing, and a phone number that rang constantly until it didn't. When the discovery came, the flyers stayed up for days, then weeks, curling at the corners as snowmelt soaked the tape. The autopsy was conducted 2 days later in a county facility built in the 60s, its fluorescent lights unforgiving. The medical examiner documented exposure consistent with prolonged cold, superficial abrasions consistent with transport over a rough surface, and no defensive injuries. Toxicology would take time. There was no evidence of sexual assault. The cause of death was ruled homicide due to exposure following unlawful restraint, a classification that satisfied neither investigators nor family but fit the findings. Someone had put her there and left her. Attention turned inward, toward routine and habit. Her last confirmed sighting was the evening after Thanksgiving. When she left the print shop around 9:20 p.m., a coworker recalled her mentioning she needed to pick up groceries and mail a package. A store receipt placed her at a supermarket 10 minutes later. A surveillance camera captured her walking to her car. The footage was grainy but clear enough to show she was alone. Phone records showed one outgoing call at 9:47 p.m. to a number registered to a pay phone outside a closed diner near the rail spur. The call lasted 32 seconds. No content could be retrieved. Investigators canvassed the area. knocking on doors with wreaths still hanging. An elderly couple recalled hearing a car idle late that night. A truck driver remembered headlights near the Spur around 10. None could describe a person. The local press covered the case carefully, avoiding speculation. Headlines spoke of young woman found dead and police seek information. Editorials urged calm. For men who read the paper over breakfast, the details lodged quietly. The weather reports shared space with updates about the investigation. Snow totals and wind chills ran alongside descriptions of evidence bags and lab delays. By Christmas Eve, the town settled into ritual, churches filled, police cruisers idled outside services. The family attended a midnight vigil organized by friends, candles shaking in the wind. Detectives stood back, notebooks closed, faces set. They had nothing to announce. Toxicology came back negative. No fingerprints of value were recovered. The footprint could not be matched. The case cooled as the ground stayed frozen. In January, the file grew thicker. Bank records showed no unusual activity. Her car was found parked legally near her apartment undisturbed. Inside, groceries spoiled in the refrigerator. A wrapped gift sat on the table, addressed but not delivered. Investigators interviewed classmates, neighbors, and former boyfriends. No threats emerged. No debts. No history of risky behavior. The simplicity was the problem. A tip line produced volume without substance. One caller claimed to have seen her get into a dark sedan. Another suggested she had been followed. A third named a local drifter who had moved on. Each lead was logged, each exhausted. Winter receded, leaving mud and impatience. By spring, resources shifted elsewhere. Years passed. The file moved from active to review. The town aged. The rail spur grew weeds. The family kept a box of clippings and letters. Every December, reporters called again asking for reflection. Detectives changed. Computers replaced file cabinets. Evidence was repackaged, relabeled, preserved. In 2012, during a routine audit prompted by a statewide cold case initiative, the box came down from a shelf. A new detective, methodical and unsentimental, read everything. He noticed the pay phone call and the diner location. He requested archived maintenance logs for the pay phone, a long shot. The records existed, scanned but unread. They listed service dates and, unexpectedly, a repair note from December 1997 mentioning vandalism and a stuck coin return. The detail mattered because it placed a technician at the diner the morning after Thanksgiving. The technician's report included a vehicle description seen parked nearby while he worked. It was specific enough to revisit. The detective ran the description through old registration databases now digitized. One match appeared within the county, owned in 1997 by a man with a minor criminal record for unlawful restraint. The man had lived 2 miles from the Spur at the time. He had since moved out of state. Records showed he worked nights and frequented the diner when it was open. In 1997, he owned a dark sedan. The detective requested a warrant for a DNA comparison using evidence preserved from the victim's coat fibers and skin cells found beneath a glove seam, material that technology could not analyze then. The sample was partial but viable. A familial search through a national database flagged a relative. The suspect was located, interviewed, and denied involvement. He could not account for his whereabouts that night. His DNA matched the partial profile within accepted statistical certainty. Charges were filed quietly. The arrest came in November, just before Thanksgiving, 15 years late. The courtroom was small. The evidence was presented without drama. The jury deliberated briefly. He was convicted of homicide and unlawful restraint. Sentencing occurred in December. Snow fell again. The family sat together. The town read the headline and folded the paper. The rail spur remained empty. The case closed. Winter did not release its grip quickly in the first years after the case went inactive. The county learned to live with uncertainty the way it lived with gray skies and salted roads. Each December brought a brief return of attention, a paragraph in the local paper, a reminder that the file still existed. Detectives rotated, budgets tightened, priorities shifted. The evidence remained boxed, sealed, and indexed, waiting for a reason to be opened again. For the victims' parents, time moved differently. They measured it in holidays endured rather than years past. Thanksgiving dinners grew quieter. Christmas trees went up later and came down earlier. New Year's Eve passed without celebration. The house kept a room that no one used, preserved not as a shrine but as an absence. They attended every memorial service held by others, understanding the language of loss without needing it explained. The investigative record from 1997 reflected diligence limited by its era. Paper logs detailed canvasses conducted door-to-door in sub-freezing temperatures. Interview summaries were typed, signed, and initialed. Cassette tapes of witness statements were labeled and shelved. Photographs were developed and mounted on cardstock. The absence of error was clear, but so was the absence of resolution. The science available then had been applied fully, and it had stopped short. In 2004, a detective attempted a secondary review. He focused on the footprint found near the brush line. Advances in footwear analysis promised new possibilities, but the cast had degraded. Moisture had compromised the edges. Measurements could be taken, but they led nowhere. Another attempt was made to re-interview residents near the rail spur. Some had died. Others had moved. Memories had softened. The effort produced sympathy and little else. By 2008, the county joined a regional task force that met quarterly to discuss unsolved homicides. The case was presented alongside others from the 70s and 80s. It was notable for its relative recency and the age of the victim. Suggestions were offered, most already tried. The consensus was familiar. Preserve, revisit when technology allows, wait. That moment came quietly, without ceremony, during a broader digitization project. Funding aimed at reducing storage costs resulted in thousands of pages being scanned. Old logs became searchable. Marginal notes once buried in binders could now be found with keywords. It was an administrative change, not an investigative breakthrough, but it altered the terrain. The detective assigned to the cold case unit approached the file without sentiment. He had worked financial crimes and internal reviews, accustomed to patterns rather than passion. He read chronologically, noting what had been done and what assumptions had guided decisions. He paid attention to small anomalies, items that did not fit the narrative because no narrative had ever solidified. The pay phone call stood out. 32 seconds to a phone outside a diner that had closed months earlier. The original investigators had logged it, canvassed the area, and moved on. The detective wondered why the number had been dialed at all. He requested maintenance records not for content but for context, an understanding of who might have been present there when few others were. The discovery of the technician's report reframed the location. It established presence at a time when presence was otherwise undocumented. The vehicle description was not evidence by itself, but it was a thread. When the description intersected with an individual known to have lived nearby and to have frequented that area, the case shifted from static to active. The suspect's history was unremarkable except for one charge in the early 90s involving restraint without injury, resolved with probation. It had not appeared significant in 1997 because it had not been connected. In the cold case context, it mattered. Records showed he owned a sedan matching the description. Employment logs placed him off work that night. Utility bills placed him in the vicinity. The decision to pursue DNA testing required approvals and patience. Evidence handling protocols had changed, but the chain of custody was intact. The sample recovered from the glove seam was minimal. Analysts cautioned about limitations. Results would not be definitive, only probabilistic. The detective proceeded anyway, aware that partial answers were better than none. The familial search that followed was conducted within legal boundaries tightened by years of debate. When the flag appeared, it was treated as a lead, not a conclusion. Investigators corroborated independently. They confirmed residences, vehicles, routines. They obtained a warrant supported by layered facts rather than a single test. The interview was recorded in a neutral room. The suspect appeared calm, cooperative, and careful. He denied knowing the victim. He acknowledged visiting the diner area in the past. He could not remember the specific night. His account contained no overt contradictions, only gaps. When confronted with the DNA results, he maintained his denial. The arrest was executed without spectacle. There were no cameras, no statements. The community learned of it through a brief notice filed with the court. Reactions were muted but attentive. Men who had read about the case years earlier read again, nodding the familiar names and the unfamiliar sense of movement. Pretrial motions addressed the admissibility of partial DNA and familial searching. The court ruled narrowly, allowing the evidence with clear instructions. Experts prepared reports explaining statistical significance in plain terms. The prosecution avoided overreach. The defense challenged methodology without theatrics. The process was slow, deliberate, and public. During trial, the narrative unfolded without embellishment. Timelines were reconstructed. Maps were shown. Weather reports from 1997 were entered into evidence. The rail spur was described as it had been then, accessible but unnoticed. The placement of the body was discussed in terms of distance and exposure, not intent. Witnesses testified about ordinary details. A coworker recalled the end of a shift. A store manager authenticated a receipt. A technician explained a repair log. Each piece alone was insufficient. Together, they formed continuity. The absence of alternative explanations mattered as much as the presence of these facts. The defense emphasized the years between crime and arrest, suggesting decay of memory and motive. The prosecution emphasized preservation and consistency. The jury listened. They asked for clarifications about probability and procedure. They took notes. Deliberations lasted less than a day. The verdict brought a restrained response. There was no applause. The judge thanked the jury. The defendant was remanded. Sentencing was scheduled for December, a date that returned the case to the season that had defined it. For the family, closure was not relief but quiet. They spoke briefly to reporters, expressing gratitude for persistence rather than satisfaction. They declined further interviews. The town moved on, carrying the knowledge that patience had mattered. The file was closed and archived again, this time with an ending. The rail spur remained a place people passed without stopping. Winter returned as it always did, indifferent. The record, however, now held a conclusion grounded in procedure, evidence, and time. The sentencing phase unfolded with the same restraint that had marked the investigation's revival. There were no grand statements, no attempts to reopen wounds for effect. The court reviewed statutory guidelines, prior history, and the gravity of a crime that had unfolded slowly, almost invisibly, across years. The judge spoke in measured language about responsibility, about acts that do not lose weight with time. The sentence imposed reflected both the unlawful restraint and the resulting death, structured to withstand appeal, grounded in precedent rather than emotion. The defendant was taken into custody immediately. His departure from the courtroom was quiet, observed by a handful of deputies and reporters who noted the absence of reaction. Outside, December wind moved across the courthouse steps, carrying the sound of traffic and the faint echo of a bell from a nearby church preparing for Christmas services. Life resumed around the building as it always had. For investigators, the case did not end with the verdict. Reports were finalized. Evidence was re-inventoried one last time. The cold case unit documented the steps that had led to resolution, identifying processes that could be applied elsewhere. The significance was not framed as triumph but as instruction. Small details preserved could become decisive later. Administrative records could matter. Patience could be operational rather than abstract. The county held no formal announcement. A short press release confirmed the conviction and sentence. Local papers ran the story on an inside page beneath holiday advertisements and weather forecasts. The tone was factual. Editors understood their audience. Many readers remembered the first articles from 1997, the grainy photograph, the uncertainty. Now there was an ending, and it did not require emphasis. The victim's family requested privacy. They attended a small service after sentencing, not a memorial but a gathering of close relatives. There were no speeches. They shared a meal, simple and quiet. The room once kept unused was opened and repurposed. Some belongings were given away. Others were kept. The calendar turned. In the months that followed, the town adjusted without ceremony. The rail spur was scheduled for redevelopment, part of a long-delayed infrastructure project. During preliminary surveys, workers noted the exact location where the body had been found, now marked only by coordinates in a report. No marker was placed. There was no need. The significance existed in memory and record. The detective who had reopened the case returned to other work. He declined interviews, preferring to let the documentation speak. In internal meetings, he emphasized the importance of audits and digitization. He noted that resolution had not come from a single breakthrough but from alignment, from a moment when tools and records finally met. The lesson was practical, not inspirational. At the state level, the case was cited in training materials as an example of lawful familial DNA use within constrained parameters. Legal analysts noted the careful approach taken to avoid over-reliance on emerging science. The ruling became part of a growing body of case law defining acceptable boundaries. The case contributed quietly to broader practice. For men who followed such matters, often from a distance shaped by years and experience, the story resonated not for its drama, but for its familiarity. It reflected systems aging alongside those who relied on them. It suggested that answers could come late and still matter. It aligned with a worldview shaped by work done steadily, without expectation of recognition. Each Thanksgiving thereafter, the local paper ran a brief item recalling resolved cases from past decades. This one appeared once, then was omitted. There was no need to repeat it. The community understood that remembrance did not require repetition. Christmas lights went up. New Year's Eve passed with routine acknowledgments of time's movement. The courthouse archive stored the final file in a climate-controlled room. Digital copies were backed up. Physical evidence was retained per statute. The chain of custody ended in permanence rather than uncertainty. A notation indicated closure by conviction. The language was simple, sufficient. Years later, a graduate student researching cold case methodologies requested access to anonymized records. The county approved. The student noted the role of maintenance logs, a detail often overlooked. The finding was presented at a conference attended by professionals nearing retirement and others just beginning. The discussion focused on diligence rather than luck. The victim's name appeared occasionally in academic footnotes, stripped of personal detail, representing a category rather than a person. This abstraction was necessary for study, but did not erase the reality that had prompted it. Those closest to the case understood the difference. As time continued, the defendant exhausted appeals without success. Courts upheld the conviction, citing the careful accumulation of evidence and adherence to procedure. The process reaffirmed that the resolution was durable. There would be no reopening, no doubt cast from technical error. In the region, other cold cases remained unresolved. Some would stay that way. Investigators acknowledged limits without surrender. The solved case became a reference point, a reminder that waiting was not the same as abandoning. It reinforced the value of preservation, even when progress seemed unlikely. The landscape changed gradually. New roads altered traffic patterns. Businesses opened and closed. The diner near the pay phone was demolished, its lot repurposed. The pay phone itself had long been removed, a relic of another era. Yet its record remained, scanned and searchable, a line of text that had bridged decades. On winter mornings, frost still gathered on branches along the former rail line. People walked dogs, unaware of the history beneath their feet. There was no plaque to instruct them otherwise. The absence of markers reflected a choice to let the place return to ordinary use. The case's resolution did not bring celebration. It brought alignment. The facts matched the outcome. The system functioned as intended, albeit slowly. For those who value order and process, that was sufficient. As the years passed, the story settled into its final form, unchanged by retelling. It remained a record of a young woman lost, a community patient, and an answer found through persistence. Winter continued to arrive each year, predictable and indifferent. The difference was that one season no longer carried unanswered questions, only a quiet acknowledgement of what had been done and what had been learned. The quiet aftermath of the case was marked less by absence than by normalization. Once the legal process concluded, the rhythms of the county resumed their familiar cadence. Snowplows traced the same routes each winter. Courthouse clerks filed new motions unrelated to the past. The solved case became one among many entries in annual reports, its significance understood but no longer foregrounded. Resolution did not alter daily life. It clarified it. For law enforcement, the closing of the file allowed a retrospective clarity. Supervisors reviewed timelines and resource allocations, confirming that the original investigation had followed accepted standards of its time. There was no misconduct to correct, no negligence to address. The delay between crime and arrest reflected technological limits rather than human failure. This distinction mattered internally. It preserved confidence without denying cost. The medical examiner's final addendum, issued years after the original autopsy, summarized the findings with updated terminology. It did not change the cause of death. It refined language to reflect modern understanding of exposure following restraint. The document was brief, clinical, and precise. It replaced ambiguity with closure, an administrative endpoint to a long uncertainty. The victim's parents received copies of the final rulings and reports. They read them once. They did not seek further explanation. The documents confirmed what had already been accepted emotionally, that their daughter's death had been acknowledged fully by the system responsible for addressing it. That acknowledgement, rather than punishment alone, carried weight. In the broader community, the case influenced how later disappearances were perceived. Residents became more attentive to routine details, more likely to report unusual observations without embellishment. Local police departments refined protocols for preserving minor records, understanding that future value could not be predicted. The lesson embedded itself quietly into practice. The man convicted served his sentence in a state facility several hours away. He remained largely anonymous beyond court records. There were no interviews, no attempts at explanation. His existence continued within institutional boundaries, separate from the community he had once inhabited. The distance reinforced finality. During one December many years later, a brief retrospective appeared in a regional magazine focused on resolved cold cases. It described the investigation without naming the town, emphasizing method over narrative. The article concluded that patience and record-keeping were the decisive factors. Readers accustomed to sensational accounts noted the restraint. The story aligned with lived experience rather than entertainment. The rail spur redevelopment was completed. A paved path replaced gravel. Lighting improved visibility. Families walked there in daylight hours. The site's history was not advertised, but neither was it erased. Those who knew could point to a location and recall. Those who did not simply pass through. Both outcomes were acceptable. In training sessions, younger detectives learned about the case as an example of continuity. Instructors highlighted the importance of respecting previous work, of assuming competence rather than error. The case illustrated how investigations could pause without failing, waiting for conditions to change. This perspective countered a culture of urgency that sometimes led to shortcuts. The county archive retained the physical evidence until statutory limits allowed for disposition. When that time arrived, a small committee authorized destruction in accordance with policy. The process was documented. There was no ceremony. The act symbolized trust in the conclusion reached. It marked a transition from preservation to history. Each winter, as holidays approached, families in the region prepared as they always had. Some traditions evolved, others remained fixed. The solved case did not intrude on these moments. Its presence was background knowledge, integrated but unobtrusive. The season no longer carried unanswered tension tied to that year. For those who had followed the case closely, particularly older men who had seen institutions change over decades, the resolution affirmed a belief in gradual progress. It suggested that systems, while imperfect, could correct over time. This belief did not depend on optimism. It rested on observation. The final appellate opinion, issued without fanfare, closed the legal door definitively. It affirmed the lower court's findings and methodology. The language was conservative. It emphasized standard of review and sufficiency of evidence. The decision joined others in legal databases, accessible but rarely cited. Its importance lay in confirmation rather than precedent. The victim's name gradually appeared less frequently in public discourse. This fading was not neglect. It reflected completion. Memory shifted from active concern to settled acknowledgement. The family marked anniversaries privately. The community respected that boundary. In conversations about unsolved crimes, the case was occasionally referenced as proof that time alone did not preclude answers. Investigators cautioned against expectation. Not every case would follow the same path. The factors that aligned here were specific and uncommon. Hope was tempered by realism. As years continued to pass, technology advanced further. Methods once considered cutting-edge became routine. New challenges emerged around privacy and data management. The case remained instructive within these debates, illustrating both benefit and restraint. It underscored the necessity of balance. The physical landscape bore little resemblance to 1997. Buildings changed. Roads were rerouted. The diner was gone. The pay phone was a memory. Yet records preserved these elements in detail sufficient to matter. The contrast between physical disappearance and documentary persistence defined the case's resolution. Ultimately, the story settled into a form consistent with its tone. It was not dramatic. It did not hinge on confession or revelation. It unfolded through accumulation and verification. It concluded with lawful accountability and quiet aftermath. The ending did not redeem the loss, but it acknowledged it fully. In the final assessment, the case demonstrated the value of methodical procedure carried across time. It affirmed that answers could emerge without spectacle, that justice could arrive late and still be meaningful. For those who lived through the original uncertainty, this conclusion offered a measured peace. Winter continued to return, as it always would, bringing with it familiar rituals and reflections. One winter no longer carried an open question. The silence that once surrounded the rail spur became simply silence again, no longer weighted by absence but by resolution. The record stood complete, and the season moved on.